Welcome. Another lecture for revision for Human Resources, Unit 4, Outcome 1, Part C, Employee Relations. So here we're going to look at the employee relations component of this part of the study design. Now, employee relations is an area that does cause students a lot of confusion. It doesn't really need to, I think, when we get nut down and have a look at past exam questions. The important thing about employee relations is that it sets up that important contractual relationship between employees and the employer. Now, what we need to know here are the dot points in terms of relating to business strategy, similarities and differences. And I've got all the dot points lined up as per usual, so we'll get straight into them. Now, the first thing to note about employee relations is the relationship to business objectives and business strategy. And the easiest way to look at this is if you have good employee relations or if you have poor employee relations, what is the outcome on these business objectives and strategy? And we can just link back to the other components of human resources, really. If you have good employee relations, it means that the relationship is positive, there is good faith bargaining going on, and while there may be some conflict, it is resolved in a very forthright, honest, open manner. Poor employee relations means there's resentfulness and possibly, angst between the two parties, and poor attitudes possibly between the two parties. So what happens with poor employee relations? It leads to poor productivity, poor low levels of motivation, possibly high staff turnover, and all those things that we know that are bad for business objectives and business strategy, because they increase costs and they lead to poor company performance. Good employee relations, if it's done well, if good faith bargaining is in place, if productivity improvements are linked to pay rises, then we can see really good employee relations, positive relationships between management and employees. This can lead to really good outcomes in terms of innovation, increases in productivity and low staff turnover. So it's really that simple. And to this end, I've never seen a question on the exam related to this. Perhaps this year's the year, but somehow I doubt it. But we're not going to crystal ball. We just need to understand each of the dot points. So the relationship to business objectives and business strategy is not that different to the other areas of outcome, Unit 4, Outcome 1 in Human Resources. Okay, let's get on to the similarities and differences between the centralised and the decentralised approaches. Now, the centralised approach was in play when before you guys were born, which makes it a little bit sort of unreal. And some of the things that we might describe in the centralised system, such as demarcation disputes, are not relevant to you guys, and you can't sort of imagine how they'd occur in the current world in 2015. But you do have to have that sort of idea of what went on in the centralised wage fixing system. And how that's different to the current decentralised approach. So you must know or have knowledge of at least 3 similarities and differences. And you must be able to clearly distinguish these similarities and differences from each other. So the similarities might be that both have a centralised authority. Now, they have slightly different roles, but yes, both have a centralised authority. The Fair Work Australia in the Fair Work Commission rather in the current system, and the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, or the AIRC, in the old centralised system. Both systems have awards, yes. So the current awards in the decentralised system underpin minimum wages, and they are the sort of basis point or the bottom point from which negotiations of enterprise bargaining can occur. And of course, unions are still relevant in today's world, as well as in the centralised system. Now, they probably had more power in the centralised system, but they still exist to protect workers' rights. Just as they did then, they still do. And we've got, industrial action going on at the moment in the transport industry, train and tram workers going out on strike, and that's all at the, organised by the unions who bring those workers together. To form a sort of powerful group. Some of the main differences you might like to look at are the fact that in the decentralised system, enterprise bargaining dominates. If there's one thing you should get from this mini topic, if you like, it's this link to enterprise bargaining, which is the important part of the decentralised system. Whereas most wages were determined by awards in the centralised system, particularly for labour, blue collar type work. Dispute settlement is different in both systems. Whereas it used to be done by the AIRC, it's now done at the workplace level only by the Fair Work Commission as a last resort. Laws allowing union involvement have changed, meaning that unions have to jump through many more hoops to take industrial action in the current decentralised system, and that the laws are a lot tighter on union behaviour. Now, they're just some of the similarities and differences. You could also go into differences about how the central authority operates, the willingness to do dispute settlement and things like that. So there's a number of different ways, but these are just 3 examples of 3 similarities and 3 differences. And you should also probably know the advantages of the decentralised system, some form of justification as to why the government in 1993 and then 1996 flicked the switch to go from one to the other. And some justification, and it basically comes down to the productivity of the nation. Okay. 2013, question 2, compare the centralised and decentralised approaches to employee relations. Compare, really important, this means similarities and differences. Okay, so what I would do here is 4 paragraphs, 1 similarity, another similarity, 1 difference, another difference. Really break down your paragraphs exactly like that, so the examiner can just go, yep, 1 tick, 2 tick, 3 tick, 4 tick, and you've just got your 4 marks. It's a straight theory question. Okay, and sometimes these questions can be straight theory. So there should be no problems with a question like this if you understand the employee relations and the similarities and differences. In 2011, 2 years before that, again, this is virtually the same question, asked a slightly different way. Explain the similarities and differences between the centralised and decentralised approaches to employee relations. I'm not even going to go through it because it's exactly the same structure. So 2 similarities, 2 differences, 4 paragraphs, 4 marks. And again, a straight theory question. They have been reluctant in the past to really get you to apply employee relations to case studies. Maybe it's too difficult for them, I don't know. But there isn't a lot in past exams. When we get to the next dot point in the study design, you have to have a knowledge of industry-wide awards, collective agreements within an individual organisation and individual contracts. So, industry-wide awards, yes, these can be used in the current system. So these are all in the current decentralised system. You need to be able to define these, compare them to each other, explain them in the context of the decentralised system, and apply them to specific situations. Now, the exam hasn't directly, in the past, assessed this dot point here, but it's obviously it's required that knowledge to answer the questions we just looked at before. You need to know what enterprise bargaining is, and therefore you need to know what collective agreements are. But to this end, it hasn't been examined. Now, this is something that could easily be examined in terms of definitions or just a quick compare question, similarities and differences. Or possibly even a recommendation of which type of agreement an organisation should go with. Okay, so onto the role of human resource managers in employee relations under the new decentralised approach, or it's not that new, of course, but under the current decentralised approach. This role is not POLC, so you are not required to do POLC when it's the role of an HR manager in relation to employee relations. This revolves around your knowledge of things like good faith bargaining. So this includes things like, okay, well, the role of the HR manager is to conduct good faith bargaining. Why? Because that's what the laws say in relation to enterprise bargaining. They must negotiate collective agreements. And of course, they must negotiate on behalf of the management team, the owners. the HR manager is part of that team. So they're not about giving away a heap of entitlements to employees. It's about finding a balance that works for the company and is going to be good for the employees as well. They must have a knowledge of relevant laws and changes in awards, which may change the minimum standards that they're negotiating. This is really important that they have an up-to-date knowledge, because these things change all the time, and the minimum wage gets evaluated every year, and the awards get re-evaluated every 3 or 4 years. Ensuring that any agreement is carried out according to agreed terms of pay and conditions. So this means that if you have negotiated in good faith an enterprise bargaining agreement, that you actually carry out all the terms of that agreement. Now, to this end, this question has been asked in past exams. So if we look at last year's exam, it's got a question here: under a decentralised approach, explain the role of the HR manager in employee relations. Now, here I would talk about 2 roles that they carry out, so 1 and 2, and I would talk about, okay, it's their negotiate an enterprise bargaining agreement. So, an EBA. Here you need to talk about good faith bargaining, yeah? So it's important that you then distinguish what the other role is. Now, the other role might be the knowledge role, knowledge of laws. It could be negotiate conflict. So there's plenty of things that the HR manager needs to do in the current employee relations environment. Obviously, you need to have, I would suggest, 3 clear and well-explained pieces of knowledge in this area, just in case it was asked again. All right, that takes us to our last dot point, which is management styles and skills in employee relations, including their application to the resolution of conflict. Okay, and of course this can be related back to the exam question we just looked at a little bit. But basically, if we're talking about management styles and decentralised system, we're talking about consultative and participative. My class this year had a really good debate about, which management style is actually the right one to use. Enterprise bargaining is a participative process, but I believe the consultative management style comes out in the end, because it's the management that can say, we're not signing this. And it's sort of, to me, it remains their prerogative to do that. But of course, employees have to vote on it, so it is a fairly participative process. You wouldn't be wrong if you did either of these. So the examiners aren't going to nitpick as long as you choose one of these when you're talking about enterprise bargaining. Okay. Management skills in a decentralised system, obviously communication. Now, if you understand your points in good faith bargaining, you'll know that communication comes in, and you relate these back to good faith bargaining. If you did that, if you're asked a question about this, if you did that, you would be in very good shape, and the examiner would be very impressed. So if you talk about communication, because the good faith bargaining requirements require you to inform people of proposed changes in writing. So that's written communication. Negotiation is an obvious one. Emotional intelligence is one that needs to be taken into account, because these are emotive issues. People's work and their pay and conditions, they're emotive issues. And, if you see anyone strike on television, you'll see that there are emotive issues. Time management is also important. Management do not want this to drag on. So negotiations that drag on are more likely to lead to industrial action or, poor levels of motivation. And basically, it's a time when people sort of can take their eye off the ball in terms of their normal work. So you don't want to spend months and months and months tied down in bitter negotiations. So time management can be important in this area of employee relations in negotiating enterprise bargaining agreements. And of course, you can apply them to the resolution of conflict. Now, when the study design says resolution of conflict, I'm not thinking about conflict between 2 people at the workplace. I'm talking about conflict caused by disagreement over pay and conditions, which is the whole enterprise bargaining thing. So I prefer to bunk that into enterprise bargaining in the new decentralised system. If you're wondering why I haven't mentioned resolution of conflict earlier in isolation. Okay, so employee relations, it doesn't have to be as hard as some people imagine it when they settle down at the end of the year and they think, that's a topic they couldn't do very well. I think having that basic knowledge of the centralised system, having a good knowledge of good faith bargaining, even though it's not in the study design, it leads to other factors within the study design. And I think that's well worth looking at, because that's the law that says this is how we must negotiate our, enterprise bargaining agreements, which are the collective agreements or individual contracts that are in the study design. Okay, that wraps it up. A nice short